Hello and welcome to The Next Page, the podcast of the Library and Archives at UN Geneva. I'm Amy Smith, and today I'm really delighted to have with me Ellie Hutterli. Ellie is a senior Swiss UN Youth Delegate for 22-24, and she attended the 78th UN General Assembly Third Committee, and her priority topics are sustainable cities and communities, digitalization, reduced inequalities, and she has a special focus on gender equality and youth participation and inclusion. In fact, Ellie has been actively involved in advancing youth participation in her home region, even before holding the mandate as Swiss UN Youth Delegate, as she co-founded and was co-president for 6 years of a local youth parliament. So, welcome, Ellie.
Thank you so much. I'm very delighted to be here as well and excited what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit more about what inspired you to become a youth delegate to the UN for Switzerland.
Gladly. I think it was not like one specific moment, but it really has been overall, again, that I've become active from a very young age locally in youth participation and inclusion. And I think really like the wish to see a more sustainable future, a more youth-led future as well. And of course, the fascination with what is the UN, how does it work, what can actually be achieved within the structures is, I think, what really made me apply to this mandate at the end.
Fantastic. And what are the special interests? So we mentioned it briefly, but tell us a little bit more.
I mean, you covered it more or less. And I mean, I would say generally I'm interested in most things that just come across my desk because I'm very interested, again, in the inner workings of the world, of the UN. But I think there's definitely areas that I'm drawn to because I just see a lot of challenges there, especially for youth, or just because I've particularly been touched by these things. So again, of course, one is gender equality, just stemming, of course, also from my own experience in this world as a woman. And then, of course, also digitalization with really like the lack of laws and regulations we have in this space and how it particularly also influences youth as well.
Yeah. So you mentioned about things coming across your desk. Tell us a little bit more about the purpose of the program.
I mean, the purpose of the program foremost is, of course, to, especially on a symbolic level, increase the engagement of youth at the UN, to really make ourselves seen there and take up a little bit of the space. But at the same time, it is also to raise awareness amongst, of course, in my case now, particularly Swiss youth for the United Nations, also for the Agenda 2030 as well. And since Switzerland is now a member of the Security Council, that's also a little bit something that we're trying to step up a little bit into that agenda as well to really raise awareness amongst youth.
That must be really interesting.
Yes.
So you attended the General Assembly in New York. Have you participated in other conferences?
So the mandate is structured in a way, I'm not the only youth delegate, as you mentioned in the introduction, and the mandate is structured in a way for us now, like they're different across all the countries, but in Switzerland it's that each one of us gets to go to one international conference, meaning New York. And apart from that, we are quite free in our mandate and what it entails, like in which conferences it entails. I've attended other ones, but of course it's always a little bit of a struggle between like personal time and effort and there being so many ones that you could attend possibly. I've been quite active, of course, then on a national level as well. I've been, for example, at the International Cooperation Forum that's always hosted by Switzerland, which is not necessarily in a UN context, but that's really a lot of what we do is not necessarily in a UN context. It's related to topics that the UN talks and works a lot on, works a lot on. And of course, things we are generally interested in to make our voice heard. But we've been part also of a few conferences or forums here in Geneva. I mean, for one, we visited Human Rights Council, especially when they had an intervention on youth. And the last time I was here, I was part of the Regional Sustainable Development Forum, and that was quite excited because I actually had the chance to end up being part of the Swiss delegation and also hold a statement on behalf of youth in the closing plenary.
That's really good. What was the most meaningful part of all of those experiences for you?
Oh, I think it's hard to answer. I think maybe I will be better at answering this question in like 6 months when my mandate is over. I had a little bit of time to recap. Of course, I mean, the insights that I've gained are extremely valuable. What is the most meaningful is, I think, really to understand that we as youth really have the power for change. And again, it's not only like to make our voice heard and our demands heard, but really also that I think we have a different understanding of what the world is supposed to be like, and to then also like bring this into pre-existing systems and structures and really like amend them so that they can work for a sustainable future.
Absolutely. I know that one of your areas of really deep concern is gender equality and women's rights. Speaking particularly about young women of your generation and girls in the European region, how are the challenges you face unique, and what sort of targeted approaches do you think are needed to address these concerns?
I think, first of all, there's many challenges that we face that are not only unique at the moment to girls, but unique to youth. And I think being young, being part of youth has always been a challenging thing, I think, across all generations, because I think there's always a little bit been this divide between like the system that currently exists and what youth really sees for their future. And yeah, I mean, there's many things that ought to change but aren't really, and I think we understood this very well. But I think apart from that, of course, something that is of great concern is like this, what I would say, big underbelly of divide between the two genders that we especially see online now, with young men being more drawn to not necessarily even right-wing politics, but definitely right-wing views on gender equality, or again, even the stance that gender equality has been achieved, if not overachieved even, which I think is very dangerous, because I think it fosters this mindset of, you know, a battle instead of collaboration, which I think for me, gender equality is all about.
Yeah, I was going to ask you a bit about this. We've seen a lot of reports recently, things coming up in the press, The Economist, for example, showing about this widening gap in Western countries on the political views. It's very divided across the genders. And I was really wondering, do you find that this is very much the case in Switzerland?
I do. I have to say as well that I come from a non-academic background from my household as well. My parents are both Swiss, so I think I've had, you know, really the luck to be very integrated in my community, which I think gives you a really good insight. And also the home region where I'm from, the majority of the parliament is right-wing. And also there's a huge youth movement, which, you know, is like the youth party to the mother party that is right-wing as well. And I know a lot of young people, young men and women, but again, mostly men, are very young that are very right-wing. And so I definitely see that, and also see that more and more men also my age are quite comfortable with voicing their doubts, I would say, about gender equality and if it is still needed or already achieved.
And what about the women? What do they think?
I mean, again, it's like hard maybe to speak for everyone here, but I mean, because we have a lived experience of what it is to be a woman. And I mean, it's also reported, of course, like historically and statistically. But again, I think most importantly, I think we know what it feels like to be a woman. So I think there is a little bit less, but I think the doubts can still come in question, where you really think, you know, how much of it is actually gender inequality and how much is maybe really that we are made to believe that we don't have equality. I do see that also a bit being a topic online, but I would say like most women are still pro-gender equality. They know there's still a long way to go. But then on the other hand, I think a lot of them are still quite uncomfortable to call themselves feminists, which I find a little bit concerning, because I think being a feminist, at least in my understanding, means to be pro-gender equality, means to be pro women's rights, which is also for me human rights as well. So I find it quite concerning that a lot of people disassociate themselves with that term, with that terminology of being a feminist. I think it has quite a negative connotation. I think that is quite concerning, which I also think is a little bit also breeding ground of these views that come from the other spectrum. Like, I think that really ultra feminist that's very on the other side of the spectrum, can be very easily attacked.
You mentioned things circulating online. How do you find that social media is really affecting the views of young people around women's rights?
I mean, first of all, I think it is a huge bubble. I think you really get wrapped into this bubble. You get one view only. It's not a discourse really. And of course, the algorithms are feeding the extremes. They're feeding the extremes, which I think don't really apply to the real world. And I think it, again, fostered this great sense of understanding, particularly amongst young men, that they're now, because of gender equality, because the advancement of women, that they now have to step back. So that actually their part of the gender equality is not being realized.
So experience of loss.
Yes, I think experience of loss, yeah, very much so. I think that a little bit like the sense of, oh, now we are so pro-woman that a woman will get the job over a man just because she's a woman. Yeah.
Do you have any ideas around addressing these issues for your generation?
I mean, it's always hard to say this is the one solution, but I think definitely what is needed is a discourse around this. And I think that's extremely important. And I think maybe also a little bit what we missed, especially again, maybe from the feminist movement side, to really integrate men more into the discourse from the start. I understand very well that historically it started out as, a little bit of an against, which came from both sides of the sexes. I think it was because of the context more than of, any agenda. I don't think again, the idea of feminists, I don't know, let's say in the 70s or 80s was to fight against men. I think they did want collaboration. It just wasn't possible at the time. But I think we've definitely arrived at a point where collaboration is not only possible, but I think it is really, really needed, because otherwise we're just seeing another divide. And I think there's so much that comes from gender equality and advancing women that really, I think, advances men just as much.
Quite right. Let's talk a little about multilateralism. That's the aim of this podcast too. So the Secretary General's report, Our Common Agenda, highlights the role of youth, and it's a constant concern for us to include youth in the work at the UN. From your perspective as a youth delegate, do you think the UN is doing enough to include youth perspectives?
Enough is a little bit hard to say, because the question there is how would you quantify enough maybe as well? But I don't think it's enough. There's definitely more need to include youth perspectives, and not only in numbers, but really also in how meaningful that inclusion is. I mean, that's obviously a big topic of ours within the different youth delegate programs because now we are there. We have a space now at the UN. We get spaces to hold statements, to meet with other delegates, to meet with UN agencies. But the question is really how can we actually advance the UN and its agenda? How can what we see for our future, how can that actually be part of the UN?
So less as an experience of being at the UN and more actual participation?
Yes, I think more actual participation. I think what's one topic that is, of course, what we discuss a lot is also being part of consultations, because what I now came to understand within my mandate, what happens at the UN is usually kind of already the finished product, even though there are discussion, even though there's a General Assembly. The countries will have advised themselves on which stance to take beforehand. They will have advised with whomever it may concern, including civil society, which, by the way, I think is a great tip here also for maybe other young people listening, if they really want to make themselves more heard within the UN. A great way is also to go over their respective country, over their Department of Foreign Affairs, because most likely their UN section will hold civil society consultations. And yeah, that would really be something for us that would be important to be more included in everything that goes on behind the scenes, really, as well.
What more would you like to see done to address concerns of future generations?
I hope I really speak here now on behalf of my team and you and youth delegates in general, but youth across the board. One thing, of course, is definitely to future-proof resolutions. I think resolutions need to have a stronger focus on the future. Of course, again, one part generally is youth inclusion, which is also a means to achieve that. And I think generally what we are really wishing for overall, what we think we need to have the future we not only envision for ourselves, but I really think that is needed for humanity and for prosperity in every sense for this planet and for ourselves, is to also make the UN system more effective. And of course, that's extremely difficult. We understand that. We understand that that's not going to be done from one day to another. And it also doesn't mean that we have the solution. But we definitely know that something is going wrong if the UN is failing to really address these huge issues that we're having right now, which is exactly what it was designed for, when there's no common ground found. And of course, this general way of doing diplomacy where you always agree on the least common ground, which of course I understand from a strategic perspective or a practical perspective, but it just doesn't get us where we need to go.
You seem to have quite a lot of vision, but I'm quite often struck in conversations with young people by a certain lack of hope, I think, in the future. Do you find that to be the case as a youth delegate?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, I've experienced it myself many times, and I know that it's the same for youth, whether they're active or inactive in any way. Because again, if you're inactive, you're probably inactive because you're already hopeless. And if you're active, you just come across so many barriers, and where you really see the system is not made for the future we need, that I think it can make you quite hopeless. And I think that's really what we experience, because we know what we need. We know what we need for the future. We know what we need to achieve the Agenda 2030. We know all these things, but yet it's not being achieved. And I think that's really a system failure, which is also why, the climate youth will always say no climate change without system change. And I think that is truly the case. I think the system is broken.
What are your hopes for the Summit of the Future that will happen later this year?
I mean, what we just discussed now, of course, more youth inclusion, to have stronger future-proof resolutions, generally to have stronger resolutions and a stronger commitment to the goals. Again, there it's always a little bit the divide once more between what should be and what is. And again, I'm well versed in what diplomacy means, what a resolution entails, that it cannot be binding, that the language is more suggesting, and also not really having any specific targets to commit to. But I think that is really sometimes what we still wish for, even though if it's not foreseen. But yeah, just for youth to be included more there and then when the Summit of the Future happens, to be in New York, and also to really be listened to, but also, of course, already now in the consultation process, we've really tried to push to be part of this. And I mean, there is also huge credit that goes out to the other UN Youth Delegates, my co-delegates that are with me, particularly also Arlinda, which has been on the podcast as well. She's really done a great deal in trying to get our views included as a team, over Switzerland for the Summit of the Future, but also across the board for youth to be included more for the Summit of the Future. And actually, we've certain youth delegates have written petition, I think it was, to really call for more youth to be included at the Summit of the Future.
Excellent. So I was going to ask you a question. If there was one thing you could change to make a difference, what would you choose to do as a priority?
As a priority, I would definitely, let's say it this way, I would prioritize the UN 2.0. Definitely, like a new way of doing multilateralism, because even if we include more youth, which of course is incredibly important and definitely also would, I think, help to get there. But if the system isn't changing and if the system doesn't want to be changed, then nothing is going to change. And so I think we definitely need a new way of doing international relations, doing diplomacy and multilateralism. And I definitely think that the UN should be modernized, and I think also should therefore really move into a new understanding of diplomacy and world politics, because we are a global world with global challenges. And I think the UN definitely needs to get stronger, and I think therefore also more dynamic to actually be able to address these issues.
Thank you, Ellie. This is really bringing us new perspectives and new hope, I think. I was wondering, finally, if you have anything else you want to add to this, or perhaps even whether you have a book suggestion for us.
Oh, wow, book suggestion. I do, in fact, but I have not personally yet read the book. It just has come out and it's hardly available, especially in Switzerland. But I've met the person who wrote it, and she's quite impressive, and she has really dedicated her life to fight for human rights, to fight for a stronger multilateral system because of that as well. But in particularly, of course, her focus was on advancing gender equality. And the book is called Outspoken, My Fight for Freedom and Human Rights in Afghanistan by Dr. Seema Samar, who is also bringing her issues to the UN and really trying to advance gender equality.
Ellie, thank you very much for being with us today.
Well, thank you so much to you. It was truly a pleasure. And of course, I wish we could talk about this forever. I think there's so much to say, but yeah, I think there will be many more podcast episodes where other people will get the chance to do so. And yeah, thank you so much for having me.